just broadly speaking, when we're thinking about the lifetime cost of a car, how did you come and what did you arrive at as the total cost of car ownership?
Yeah, the easiest way I think to think about it is in whole numbers, right? Just rounding up. The number that I tell people is about 50 cents per mile. The exact number, I think, in that 2023 update was maybe 47 or 48 cents per mile. But to make it easier to remember, 50 cents per mile. And that accounts for all those costs that we just talked about in the kind of the last little section, Peter. And that amortizes those costs over the entire life of the car. Earlier in a car's life, it's typically more expensive to drive. It might be 60 or 70 cents per mile. And then later on in life, it actually does get cheaper to drive simply because it's depreciating less and less every year. It might only be 40 or 45 cents per mile to drive. And one interesting thing I think from kind of the analysis and some of the numbers that I crunched is that new cars versus used cars actually have a surprisingly similar cost to drive. In other words, if we want to put it in investing terms, and it's actually a really accurate metaphor, the used car market is getting more and more efficiently priced. There was a time, probably when our parents were growing up, there was this information asymmetry when it came to the used car market, and you were more likely to find an amazing deal on the used car market. You were also more likely to find terrible deals, lemons, on the used car market. But over time, with things like factory refurb and dealerships putting their stamp of approval on used cars, the more information that we've gathered that used cars can be reliable, they've also become priced more efficiently, more accurately, in such a way that the cost per mile of the average used car with a factory stamp of approval on it is basically the same as the cost per mile of a brand new car. There might be anecdotal data from people in your life that say otherwise, and I'm sure those anecdotes are true. But if we look at the sum total of the data set, there really isn't a big pricing difference between used cars and new cars.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. It was certainly something I had intended to ask you. And even in the introduction to a chapter within my book on how markets work, I use that example exactly because my father-in-law seemingly is the king of buying and selling used cars, and he has a decorated history of coming out ahead. But over the years, that advantage has shrunk as information has got incorporated into market prices. And it's something that I still see people think about in terms of how their parents were able to do it when they were children, or how they themselves have been able to do it. Maybe they're in retirement or nearing retirement, and they've done it several times themselves. But there is something there. First of all, the process of buying a car is frustrating, regardless if you're buying new or used. But at a certain point, if the cost is similar, there's almost a little bit more certainty with a new car, in my opinion. How do you feel about that?
I feel the same exact way as what you just described, that if the cost itself, if you were to sit down and build out a little spreadsheet, which, if you're math-minded, if you're used to spreadsheets, it's only going to take you an hour to do this analysis. If you find out that, sure, you might save 5% by buying used, you really do have to ask yourself, is that worth the uncertainty of not having that long-term warranty and just simply not having a car that is brand new only for you? For me, I'd rather just pay that 5% premium and buy the new car. And as we kind of discussed, that 5% premium is shrinking, if it's even there in the first place. My argument, my stance is that premium is very close to zero. And if it was only a 3% or 5% premium, that still isn't quite worth it. And another thing, Peter, right, so you talked about your dad's stories. And sure, when you're in the used car market, things like negotiations might play a slightly bigger role than it does in the new car market. I mean, you can negotiate with car salespeople in any circumstance, but if you're negotiating with another third-party owner, sure, maybe a good negotiator will have more success in the used car market. But we have to think about things like the Kelley Blue Book. The Kelley Blue Book is this amazing compendium of car knowledge that will tell you, you drive a 2012 RAV4 with 142,000 miles on it, it is worth X. And that is essentially market efficiency in the car market. That's like looking at the stock market and saying, you want to sell a share of Apple It is 175.12 today. It's just this public information that everybody gets to see, and everybody's working off that same price. So if you really want to find a premium value in the used car market, you have to be aware that everybody has access to a lot of information about these cars, and that's one of the reasons why the premium is disappearing before us.
And maybe you can still find a deal, but the amount of time that you have to put into it, whether it's seeking out an underpriced car relative to a market value or going through a very extensive negotiation process and maybe even failing in some negotiations where you don't end up getting the car, that time has a cost. If you enjoy it, sure. But here's what I would tell listeners. Jesse and I clearly agree that if all you've ever bought is used cars your whole life, the next time maybe you should go out and live a little, buy a new car. The cost of ownership isn't that different. And you mentioned the cost of ownership when rounding up is about 50 cents per mile. Pretty close to the government calculation in terms of what you get reimbursed from a tax perspective. And you had mentioned how people used to say, oh, Uber driving is effectively free. They're just paying me for my miles. But no, they're just paying you what you're owed effectively. I mean, how do you think about the fact that what you've come to estimate and what the government tax reimbursement for mileage used for work is?
Yeah, I largely agree with what you just said there, Peter. I mean, there's a reason you have to put yourself in the government's shoes, in the IRS's shoes. And you have to ask, well, where did this number, is it 58 and a half or 60 cents per mile in 2023? I think 58 and a half might have been 2022, but it's somewhere around there. 60 cents per mile or so is what the government reimburses. And they're not pulling that figure out of thin air. I mean, they are compiling some sort of data set on consumer costs and driving habits and wear and tear and maintenance and the same kind of factors that I looked at. And so, I mean, it's an admission by the government that driving is not free. And if you're driving specifically for work, you should get reimbursed at some sort of uniform rate based on quantifiable objective figures. So, right, I think anybody out there who is simply saying, well, my car gets 30 miles to the gallon. Gas up here in New York is about $3 a gallon. Therefore, my cost of driving a car is 10 cents a mile. I'm just going to drive all day and just shear the sheep that is the IRS for giving me this 60-cent rebate. I mean, there's a fundamental problem with that analysis is kind of the point of my article and what we're talking about here today.